associate professor. There we go. I've been with Coastline College for now 4 years, full-time. I was with them for about 1.5 years before then. And my background really has had cybersecurity as the thread throughout all of my career. I worked in law enforcement for most of my career, doing digital forensics and cyber investigations. And then after I left law enforcement, I worked for a healthcare company and a tech company, and all in cybersecurity. And whether or not it was investigations or assessments or digital forensics, I kind of wore many, many hats, policy writing, etc. So I was happy to be able to work part-time for about 1.5 years for Coastline, and now I've been full-time for 4 years. So when I came on with Coastline, this project was already in the works, meaning that we were every year in California for our funding. Besides the standard state funding for, our coursework and teaching, we, as a department, have worked with our local regional strong workforce, which is a statewide funding, but actually comes down to the Orange County area, which is where our school is located. And we request funding for different projects. And some of those are AI related, but this particular one, and cybersecurity related, technology related, this particular one started about 4 years ago with the grant writing process. And we requested funding to develop the Student Security Operations Center, because what we realized is that students, although we definitely provide them with the coursework necessary to obtain their certifications and get the curriculum side of things, where they're learning the security plus, the network plus, the server plus, they're earning those certificates, whether they're CompTIA, they're doing the hands-on part of our labs, and I'll get to one of the next slides where I show you that we do have NDG, net labs, etc. But what we saw was that they really don't have the hands-on real-life experience of working in a SOC. And looking at our regional workforce, even just today, this morning, I ran just a quick Google search to find out how many job openings in the Los Angeles and Orange County area required or requested a Splunk certification. Splunk is one of the SIEMs that's out there. And there were between 120 and 150 job openings today that require that. And some of those are tier level 2 analysts and not the 1 analyst. But we saw that there was definitely a gap where our students, although they were taking a lot of these certifications and doing these hands-on with our classes, they really weren't getting that type of work experience. And so that's where the student SOC was coming in. And so we set up a kind of a class environment where they are aligning these work expectations with DCWF work roles. And we're really trying to make them career ready because this is a volunteer experience. They are not paid. It's part of a course. We are able to give it as maybe an alternate to internships, where our students from a community college, they sometimes have a hard time getting internships compared to students in 4-year programs. And we definitely have tried to integrate it with some of the concepts and some of the, now that we've been through it for one full semester, and this is our summer program that we're hosting now for our work experience education course, we're trying to integrate it into some of our actual courses that we have. So we have an AI for cyber class, we have an ethical hacking, we have a CISA plus, we have digital forensics. We also teach Network Plus and Server Plus and those courses. And so we've tried to take some of these skills and these topics and integrate those into those classes. We're a really small, we're a very small faculty. There's only 3 of us that are full-time, but we do have part-time faculty, which definitely helps supplement some of our teaching. And one of our part-time faculty, Mike Crawford, has been helpful in putting together, working with us and doing some of the technical build out for our student SOC. So how did we get to where we are with choosing our students and having our students as part of this? So we set it up as a work experience course. So that means it is a course that students can enroll in for, and this is our, again, the spring was our first time offering this. And so we set it up where we sent out an interest list. And for our first cohort, we had 44 applicants that we actually interviewed, and we narrowed it down to 15 students. And that we settled on the 15 students due to our infrastructure issues. We put this together with used equipment, and we just didn't have the infrastructure to support more students. And so we are limited to 15 students in this work experience class. And so again, for our summer program, we also had 40 applicants, sending out an interest list and narrowing them down to 15 candidates. And we set that up. Our interview process was, we had interest from students who were just starting out in cybersecurity to the ones who have finished maybe their AS degree or their certificate program and have every CompTIA certificate, have gone through the various courses. And so to narrow it down, what we realized is that we really need a baseline of students who have earned their Security Plus certification and have taken either the digital forensics and or incident response coursework that we have. That was kind of how we narrowed it down to from those 44 students. So we also, that last bullet point there, the additional assessments, were, fortunately, because I'm also the co-advisor for Cybersecurity Club and also coach a lot of our cybersecurity kind of competition teams, I know a lot of the students, even though we're an online program. And so I've been able to work with them and see them in other environments than just the classroom. And we really wanted students to be able to work in a team environment, who were curious and would go out of their way to help their other students or research on their own, maybe how a product works or how a Trojan actually can infiltrate a system. What was their professionalism like, and how did they actually communicate? And so we added that to kind of our interview process and narrowing down. And in our interview process, we recorded it for the student. They were done over Zoom. We recorded them for the students and allowed them to actually get a copy of the interview so that they could see themselves on camera, because it's very different when they are interviewing and even doing a mock interview to actually seeing how they respond and how many times they say or yeah or something like that. So That was also a very good experience for them. It was the actual interview process. And we did ask them some technical questions. How would they walk us through a triage, an unknown alert? How would they separate false positives from real exploits? How would they preserve documentation, etc.? And we did give them a strict directive as to not use AI tools to answer during the interview. We thought that we needed to add that in there because we didn't want students to rely on AI. Although we allow AI to be used in the SOC for them to work through some of the incidents, we didn't want it in the interview process. So this is our actual SOC. The people who are identified in there are AI generated. If I did have this picture at the CAE presentation and I had put stars over the students' faces. So we decided to take the students out and we actually just put AI generated images for students in there. But this is the room. So we were able to kind of cajole our marketing department who had used this space as a green room to move someplace else. And we were able to get this space. So it was already painted black, but so we were able to get with some funding last fall, we were able to get momentum to put in some carpet. And then we went to our resort, to our kind of, I call it the boneyard, but it's the furniture warehouse where all of the used furniture goes. And we're able to get the reclaimed desks that were there, chairs that had been moved there, and then we had some funding, so we were able to buy the equipment, which were, this is the TVs on the screen, on the wall, and then we have 4 different in-person work kind of workstations that students can work with, so that they can access. So that was how we had it set up. But the students actually have our system, they can access it remotely. So they don't have to be on site to do this, which kind of adds to our equity piece and accessibility, is that students, we do have some students who actually are on the East Coast who are participating in our security operations center. And so we are able to offer this because they connect to it through WireGuard VPN for secure access, and we're able to, they're able to access it. However, we do have students who want to come on site, and so we have a schedule when somebody will be on site and they can come in and use those workstations or plug into our network. We are off of our Coastline network. We've worked with IT, that was fortunate. And they, this is all passive traffic. This is not real live traffic. We would hope to get there, but we're not there yet, being able to work with IT and Coastline. However, we have worked with Coastline in setting it up with our IT department, and they have us completely separate. And so the students are able to access this not through the normal Coastline network, but actually through VPNing and using WireGuard and 2 Proxmox systems. So this is kind of our production tools and infrastructure of how we have it set up. Again, we reclaimed these Dell servers and the HPE server from, they were decommissioned. And so we were able to get them. And our limitation right now is in our hard drive space and backups and our memory. So that's kind of one of the things that we're trying to figure out, because we do want to integrate AI into it more. How exactly are we going to do this? Are we going to add a cloud type system and kind of a subscription to like AWS or something into it? But we're going to see what kind of our funding looks like for this next year. The tools, we are using open source tools. Although we are a Splunk Academy, which means that we do get an enterprise license, we are using free tools right now. And that, again, we haven't integrated Splunk into it yet. We're hoping to maybe over the fall, but it comes down to infrastructure and issues that we have. I see some questions. And I will let me get to that right now. Let's see. What is the approximate cost? We spent about $30,000 on getting the carpet and the workstations. I think that was how much money we had in our grant. And definitely, I will share my email at the end, and so we can share. And we would really love feedback too, from a technical standpoint. And if anybody has any other tools or anything that they would suggest, we would love to hear it too. So this is just more about our network segmentation and how we have it set up. And one of the things where we're offering our students, again, the student access model, is of our 15 students, each student has their own Kali Linux and Flare VM kind of station to work in. So there is 45 different analyst machines. And then, of course, in the student SOC on-site, we're using a Windows 11 workstations for those that they can just access. And also they have, Office 365 through our Coastline school. We also have an enterprise Google Gemini and Gmail, and then as well as Enterprise Copilot. However, that is on our Coastline side, so we haven't integrated it with our SOC. Really, what we would love to do is try to get some, API keys from Anthropic or something like that down the road to be able to use, but there's the funding piece of that. So hopefully you can see this. Right now, this is what our SOC network topology had looked about the end of spring. We are going to probably, redesign this in the fall as we add a Splunk server, and hopefully be able to integrate Splunk into it, because that is really something that I've seen out there as a leader in the SEAM. And I really want to get students kind of knowledgeable and certified in that. I just think that would also give them another leg up in getting a job or an internship. So this is kind of our open source security stack that we're using right now. The backbone is Security Onion. And we do use WiCyS and Velociraptor for our digital forensics. We have found that so far these work well, and students are able to understand them, go out and do some research on their own, watch YouTube videos, and learn it. Because in our work experience courses that we have, or this one course, it is truly set up where we are not giving them hands-on, walk through labs. Like in our NDG NetLabs environment, if people are familiar with it, it really walks students through, click here, open up your Kali Linux, type this in, enter this command, etc. And we wanted to really make this, because it is work experience, it is not supposed to be set up that way, where students are truly supposed to be given an assignment, an incident, and work through it on their own as if they were at work. So we break up the students into groups of three teams of usually 5 students each, or at least we did last semester and this summer. and we have them work together. And so on a weekly basis, we have stand-up meetings like you would have at work. And we meet with them, the members. So in the spring, we had 2 weekly meetings. The summer, we're having 1, but it's 2 hours. And this is where the teams and the individuals are able to debrief. So we say, what worked, what didn't work, where people were struggling, as if they were work. And we encourage them during the week to actually work with their teammates through Discord right now. That is our platform that we're using for them to communicate. Although the course itself has a Canvas shell, it's very, very minimal. And that is only to kind of meet the requirement of the state to have an actual course, because we need to have certain things within our course and to meet our own policies for the course. And so we're able to keep that, but then our separate kind of manager role and management is through these weekly stand-ups. And so during the spring semester, it's 16 weeks. The summer, it's 8 weeks. We have about 4 to 5 incidents, exercises per, term, you could say. I think that when we started out last spring, we were very, very hopeful, and we had planned 16 different exercises for students to get through, but we found that pace was just very, very fast. And in learning the technology and working with the technology, then it was, and the hands-on piece of it, we had to slow it down a little bit. So what we are doing, of course, is building skills that students have to actually deploy elastic agents onto endpoint systems, and then set it up to make sure that they are actually getting telemetry, that they're actually getting different logs and alerts. And so we also have a network forensics kind of exercise. They're reviewing PCAPs and alerts and live team, kind of red team attacks, which is what we're entering into now, since we're entering into our last 2 weeks of our summer term. And then the team debrief. So at the end of each assignment, the team needs to either write a standard operating procedure or an incident report. We just finished, the students just finished writing an executive summary and an incident report on an examination of a PCAP file that they had to. And then they had to not only write the report, but then they had to give a short presentation to the CEO of the company that they were hired by, which was me. And I was able to ask them questions as if they were providing actually giving a presentation at work and to a client. So, which is another really great thing for students, because they don't get that opportunity to have to present, and they get to hear themselves present. So this is how the incident response lifecycle works in our student SOC. So an alert is triggered. The student then opens the case, which was created in Security Onion. They investigate the various logs, whatever it is. They kind of leverage like MITRE and figure out what the attack technique was, and actually then write it in an incident report with findings and timeline and impact assessment and recommendations, because we want them to think about, if they were kind of reporting this to a client, how would the client will want to know how to fix this, right? And what I noticed in our last exercise is that the students did so well in the technical kind of drill down in finding what happened, and some of the very, very high level recommendations. But when I asked, what files actually left the company, that was a little bit unclear. They weren't able to drill down to that type of level. They were able to see kind of some file names in the PCAPs, but they hadn't gone to the extra step in trying to decode it to figure out if they could figure out the file names, etc. So this is high level. These are kind of the exercise incidents of how we broke down our 16-week timeline course. And so these were the kind of the different deliverables and practical exercises that the students had. So the one that I was talking about that we just did was their week 3 network forensic analysis. Because of the summer, we've kind of broken it down. And for the now, since we're in the last 2 weeks, we're kind of doing this like last threat hunting to Active Directories, and it's actually a short amount of time where there's a red team attack, and that they're going to have to figure out what happened and then write the report. So this is just a little bit more detail about the different assignments that I wanted to share with you. And I realize that this presentation, I will definitely send this out so that you can, or ask Stephen to send it out so that you can read more of the details about what our different exercises were. But these are just kind of some of the assignments we have on here. And we have found that the students definitely have figured out that they oftentimes, although we have set it up to our course and we tell them it's 3 hours a week during the 16-week course that they would have to put into this, oftentimes they're spending a lot more time on their own. And that also includes the stand-up meeting that we have. They're spending more time than the 3 hours, but it's some are, some aren't. And that's why we've put them in a team environment. So hopefully that kind of balances out. Here's one of the scenarios that we just finished. Crestwood Industries, that I was the CEO, had this PCAP, and then what happened? And then they had to actually identify the what occurred. They had a couple of weeks to do this. And that the only evidence we gave them was the PCAP. They were saying that there were no endpoint logs, etc. And so they had to figure out what happened. And this is one of the deliverables. This was their incident report that they had to write as a team and then present on. We didn't have them put a PowerPoint presentation together. We just had them talk me through this, their incident report. And again, they did a great job, but it gets them also into the habit of writing reports. I'm trying to watch my time, into the process of writing reports, and then also presenting, which is another great skill for them to have. It's kind of those soft skills, right, which are really important for us, I think, as educators to teach our students. So these we find are the educational benefits. Of course, writing non-technical summaries to be able to explain to a non-technical audience what happened. People, I think, get into the weeds of using jargon, very, very technical jargon, and are able to maybe talk, throw out words like PCAP and SEAM and all of that. But if you're talking to a non-technical audience, then they could be lost. We also really, really recommend that they put this together on their GitHub repository and actually build a portfolio. And then we like that they're building skills, that they are working as a group, they're learning how to research, they're learning how to debug programs, having to add an elastic agent on a Windows system is kind of frustrating. And so they're learning how to research and figure out how do they do that. And then again, we also have had students who now have gone back and set up their home lab. So this is our our board where we are putting stars next to our students who have actually had placement, and they attribute it to this their Student Security Operations Center experience. At the end of last semester, we interviewed each of the students as the manager, which is Mike Crawford, our part-time instructor. He acts as the manager, and I was able to sit in on them. We actually spoke to each student about their experience. And of course, we learned throughout the process that we had 3 students who were able to get jobs. One's for a DoD contractor who's actually she is working as in a security analyst position. One was the an IT support help desk, and that's the student number 2. And every interview that they had, they asked about the SOC experience, and they asked about it more than any other classes or any other certs they earned. And the other student is now working for a cybersecurity consulting firm, and they had used it and added it to their GitHub repository. And so they were able to talk to it and about it in their interview process. And then at the end of it, of course, we took, this is all of we anonymized our student feedback and what they learned. And this is just some information that we gleaned from that. And we see that the technical report writing was highlighted, and that they appreciated the struggle and the difficult nature. However, they were able to kind of work through it, and that the attacks they definitely learned a lot from. And that it made sense, right? So they maybe have taken a pen test class, but now they've actually been able to see how to pen test, and it made a lot more sense, and it gave them kind of the realistic push to finally get their home lab kind of going. Of course, it wasn't without challenges, and this is what we have found, is that there definitely is still a gap in student knowledge when they come in. Even though they might have taken the Security Plus and the Digital Forensics and Incident Response courses, there's still a knowledge gap. And that is something that we are trying to work on, especially bringing more students into our cohorts. And of course, we find that 1 to 4 or 3 to 4 hours, so our 1 unit layout for our work experience course right now is inefficient because they're spending a lot more time. So maybe we move it to a 3 unit, but then that's a lot of time. That's maybe 9 hours a week. And again, our student population, we have a lot of working students and adults. And so that it maybe we're hoping that we can, if we do expand it to a 3 unit course, that we can still bring the students in. And that we found that many times students, because they're working adults, they have different schedules. So working with a team, some might have a Sunday afternoon only available, and other students can work only from 9 to 10 after they put their kids to bed, 2 days a week. So that has been a challenge too. So this is what we want to do in the future, is that we really want to add AI, like I said, to our kind of our SOC. We really want to turn this into kind of a SOC in a box, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what that means, whether or not we have infrastructure put in place. Because we do have a NetLab environment, but it's working with our NetLabs team to actually add all of this to that infrastructure, and so that we can actually host it for other schools, or do we just provide them all the VMs? We're still working through that. And then how do we utilize our infrastructure to actually create get more students involved so that we can expand it from 15 students to maybe 30. And one of the things that we're doing, we started this mid last semester in spring, and we're continuing it through this summer, is that we are having weekly training for SOC training. And one of the platforms that we're using is the NCAE Cybergames. They have a SOC challenge in their challenges, and they use GravWell. And so we've been walking through students through this, because some students have no idea even what a SOC is. So we've been working with students on this on a weekly basis. And then there's also TryHackMe that has in their free tier, so students don't need to pay for a subscription. There are some SOC fundamentals that they can walk through. And then we also have right now Hack the Box, and we've been able to use their threat range, which is a live fire kind of environment for students, and also trying to get them certified through the CDSA, which is the Hack the Box Certified Defensive Security Analyst role. So that is what we are trying to do to bring along kind of other students to get them prepared for the interview, to bring them into the fall cohort. And we're also continuing to ask for funding from our regional strong workforce, which is an annual appeal. I feel like it's an annual ask to be able to do that. So yeah, I think that's it. So let me go back. Let me start from the end. You pay for TryHackMe. So no, we're using the free tier for TryHackMe. Hack the Box. We are paying for right now. We do have funding through the end of this year, through January, for the Hack the Box threat range, which is a cost, and the enterprise, which is a cost. However, Hack the Box also has a free subscription for students. So this is definitely, and the TryHackMe is the free subscription too for students that they can get. And there are subscriptions for those, and if students want to pay out of pocket, they can, but we didn't have funding for that. Thank you, Terry, for that. I am happy to share everything with people. We have definitely met with some other schools. Let me go back to I was asked if I could do the network topology. Yes, we've met with other schools. If you would like to set up a time with either that we can go into kind of the more details about it, and actually, bring up the WireGuard and what we see and what the students see, etc. I'd be happy to do that. How long did it take to set up? Once we were able to get the equipment in the room, it's taken, as far as hours go, it probably took on or off about a month from a technical standpoint to get the Proxmox deployed, all the VMs deployed. We have been using Proxmox and the different VMs, kind of deploying those for our competition teams. And so we kind of understood how that worked and kind of the issues. We've already worked through a lot of that. So probably a good month before we launched it in the spring. So we started mid-December, and then it was ready to go. One of our issues with our infrastructure and kind of our limitation in compute power is that every exercise, after it's up for a couple of weeks, we don't have the ability to back it up. So we have to tear it down to add the new exercise and the new incident. So we're hoping with more equipment, that we're able to not do that. And so we can kind of keep it up. So it makes redeploying it kind of a time-consuming thing. I think that, yes, so I will put my Let me put my contact in the group. And let me add this. Of course, I can't type and answer in the same time. So there is my email again. Yes, we've considered using NetLab in the VMs. Yes, we have tried that. Right now, our policy for VMs is that they're in NetLab is that they're not going out to the internet. And for this, we need them to cross over and sometimes go out to the internet. So we're working through that. We're going to see maybe in August. We're supposed to sit down after the end of the semester, which is the end of July, and talk about how we can deploy it better for the fall. So we'll see. TBD, stand by, David. We'll let you know how that goes. So are you using Guacamole to serve Proxmox XS2? No, we are not, but that is a great suggestion. I have never worked in a SOC. I mean, so I appreciate any and all suggestions. So I am going to write that down because we have not. And so, Frankie, I might be reaching out to you to find out how you're doing that and how we can do that.
Well, this is great information. I'll tell you, the SOC is that when I went through that tour, it was amazing. I had a question myself: is have you had any industry partners actually come in and go through and look at the SOC and give you any feedback and what the value they felt was that SOC for hiring?
Oh, yes. So we're fortunate that we have had, yes, we've had some people who work for Mandiant and NASA and other companies, and they, of course, and Booz Allen, and they've come through, and yes, they say that we're going in the right direction. You know, because we're part of our CTE, we do have an industry board, and so advisory board, and they continuously tell us we're going in the right direction, right? And so, because we weren't sure how this was going to be, but we're seeing it, I'm seeing it just from the results from the students being able to get jobs, the students who are actually maybe who are still in the process of interviewing, I'm seeing the results there. And we will continue to work with industry. We have a local OWASP chapter, and we had a couple of those people come through, and they suggested that we give this presentation at one of the local OWASP meetings, which is full of industry, and that maybe then we can get more industry groundswell and people interested in hiring our students.
That's fantastic. Anyone have any other questions? We have a few minutes left.
We'll go ahead and stop the recording.
There we go.